Good evening, everyone. We will start shortly, just in time for everyone to arrive. Hello, everyone. My name is Thierry Gervais, and I am the head of research for the Ryerson Image Centre. On behalf of the RIC, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight for the launch of Sarah Miller's book, Documentary in Dispute, the original manuscript of Changing New York by Berenice Abbott and Elizabeth McCausland. I would like to start by acknowledging with respect the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples and their traditional territory of the dish with one spoon. The Ryerson Image Centre stands within this territory today, and we respectfully accept our collective responsibility to the land during a time of environmental upheaval and crisis. I would like to mention a few program notes before we begin. We are recording tonight's event and we'll be uploading it on our YouTube channel for those who were not able to attend tonight and for those who would like to watch it again. After the discussion, we will have a Q&A session. If you have questions throughout the discussion, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen to submit them. Other listeners can use the upvote feature to vote for popular questions in case we do not have time to address them all. And lastly, in the case of a technical difficulty, please remain patient while we correct the issue. Documentary in Dispute is the fourth volume of the RIC Books series, published by the Ryerson Image Centre in partnership with MIT Press. And I would like to provide a quick background regarding this scholarly book series. RIC Book was launched in 2016 and it's made of three streams. The first one is called Critical Ideas and gathers articles from different scholars and aims to reflect the very latest state of research in the history and theory of photography. The Public Life of Photograph, published in 2016, is part of this category, and it questioned the role of circulation in our understanding of photographs. The second stream is called Essentials. It translates into English fundamental text published in other languages and proposes critical editions of seminal books about photography. The Eye of History by philosopher Georges Didier Huberman proposes a thorough analysis of playwright Bertolt Brecht's artistic response to the flow of press photographs published during the 1930s and the 1940s. The birth of the idea of photography by historian François Brunet is also part of this stream, and it addresses the invention of photography as an invention of an idea rather than an invention of a new type of images. Finally, the last stream of RIC Books is called Collections and Archive and aims to take advantage of the Ryerson Image Centre's collection to give a point of view on a photographer or a subject. Documentary in Dispute is the first volume of this stream, and it was facilitated by two important aspects of the RIC's activity. The first one was the acquisition in 2012 of the Berenice Abbott archive, made up of 6,000 photographs and 7,000 negatives, as well as book maquettes, correspondence, personal journals, business reports, and ephemera. The second one was the granting of a research fellowship to Sarah Miller to come to the Ryerson Image Centre to study this new acquisition. But Documentary in Dispute would not have been possible without the partnership with the MIT Museum and the Museum of the City of New York, both of which embarked with enthusiasm on this editorial project. I specifically want to thank their directors, John Durant at the MIT Museum and Whitney Dunhauser at the Museum of the City of New York, as well as Lindsay Turley and Sean Corcoran at the MCNY and Gary Vincente at the MIT Museum for their continuous support also. I finally want to thank Gary Vincente again and Julia Van Aften, who contributed a fascinating paper to this volume about both the content and the making of the Abbott archive, now available in our public institution. Now I want to introduce our two speakers tonight. Sarah Miller holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and teaches history of art and history of photography at Mills College in Oakland, California. She has published many papers about the invention and contestation of documentary as a key concept in American photography, including an article in the RIC's Berenice Abbott publication edited by Gaëlle Morel in 2012. Sarah will be in discussion with Gaëlle Morel, who is the exhibition's curator at the Ryerson Image Centre. Sarah, Gaëlle, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody at the RIC who has helped to organize this event. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to reiterate thanks to all of our partners who made the book possible. And I want to thank everybody at the RIC who worked on it, so many people, but especially Thierry, as well as Paul Roth, Rachel Verbin, and Charlene Heath. Gaëlle, I'll go ahead and start my slides while you introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm very honored and happy to be having this conversation with Sarah. And I'll start with the first question. This book has several components. Could you start by giving us a brief overview of it?
So this is actually a very complex book with many parts. Part one reconstructs the book Changing New York as it could have been. It's based on the unpublished manuscript of 100 captions written by McCausland that was written in spring 1938, and it resides in the archives of the Museum of the City of New York. So Abbott's photos in our reconstruction are arranged according to the sequence and the selection of that manuscript. And where you see text in bold, of course, I don't think this is readable on your screen. It's paired with McCausland's original. Each image is paired with McCausland's original text. So underneath that, where you see lighter type, I've also reproduced the caption and the sequence placement used in the published 1939 book so that the contrast between the two texts is immediately evident. Or in some cases, I indicate that this photo was cut before the book was actually published in 1939. My reconstruction includes 14 photographs that were cut by the publisher, and that includes Church of God, Harlem, which you see on the right-hand side of this spread. And I should say that we had to make some creative decisions in how to present a reconstruction of the original manuscript, because the women did not leave a design mock-up for this version of the manuscript. So McCausland had prepared a design mock-up for an earlier version, but it doesn't translate to this version that has one text per photograph. So a couple of things that we decided to do, we bled the we bled the images and placed them differently on the pages because we knew that the women wanted a more modern layout than the one that they got. But at the same time, I also had to think about how to make this a reference work. So I have, as I said, reproduced the captions of the published book on each page so that one can make easy comparisons. So part 2 reproduces, mostly as in transcription, some amazing archival documents that shed light on the women's earliest plans for the book. And then there are also letters and memos in this section that illuminate how bitter and extensive the revision process was. They really indicate battles over practically every photograph, as well as the larger concept and format of the book. And I also, and almost everything in this section has never been published before. And that includes an introduction drafted by Henry Russell Hitchcock, which was rejected by the publisher. And then part 3 consists of scholarship. Julia Van Haften and Gary Van Zandt contributed a wonderful essay about Abbott's multiple archives, as well as her 30-year partnership with McCausland, which was both romantic and creative. And then last comes my very long essay, which is really about the development of Abbott's documentary theory. It's about the original manuscript and its implications for an expanded history of American documentary photography. And it also very much treats the context of the 1939 World's Fair, that the importance of that context for a contest over the relationship of photography to urban experience at the end of the 1930s.
Thank you. No, I think it was helpful to have that description of the different components. So my second question would be more about how did this project come about? Why does it focus just on the book Changing New York rather than the larger 1935, 1939 Changing New York series? How would you say the book is perceived and presented in the traditional history of photography, and what narrative are you hoping to change with your research today?
So this project started when I learned about the existence of McCausland's original manuscript for the, and that was written in 1938 for the book that E.P. Dutton had commissioned. And Dutton was a commercial publisher that contracted with the Federal Art Project and the Federal Writers Project to produce a book of Abbott's photographs. They did this after her very successful exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York in 1937. And they did so because they wanted to sell this book to millions of visitors who were expected to visit the World's Fair. And the theme of the fair is very important to know. It was building the world of tomorrow. And when I read that original manuscript in the archives a very long time ago, I saw immediately that it was intended to be a manifesto about Abbott's practice of interpreting the city through, through photography. And I had to ask, why on earth would the publisher reject this? And as I researched and I learned more about the battles between these two women and the publisher, but also between the women and the Federal Art Project and the Federal Writers Project, it became clear that this multi-party editorial contest was really a contest over the definition of documentary photography itself and its uses to tourism and urban experience on the eve of the fair. And here I'm showing you the dust jacket of the published book that's on the left. Ironically, a designer at Dutton made it from a detail of the photograph on the right. A photograph that the publisher actually cut from the book at the last minute. So the full image perfectly encapsulates Abbott's ethos of the past jostling the present. You see that phrase from her very earliest proposal to the Federal Art Project. I've quoted it here. You see her delight when the primitive resists the modern, but you would never know that from the brick wall detail that survived on the book cover. Focusing on the book itself as the site of dispute gave me a unique perspective on Abbott's work, I think, or it opened up new avenues. Many scholars before me had approached the whole Changing New York project, which, as you said, was undertaken from 1935 to 39. Through the lens of her sponsorship by the Federal Art Project. And so most people had felt compelled to analyze how, as something labeled documentary photography, Abbott's project must have served the New Deal agenda in some way. But focusing on that unpublished manuscript, I realized that right away that it really defies many of the expected links between documentary photography and the ideology of liberal reform programs. Shelter on the Waterfront, which I'm showing you here, is a great example. For Abbott, this photo is not about, in any conventional sense, the plight of the unemployed or the misery of their waterfront shack. Instead, McCausland's original caption for this would have really encouraged the viewer to see it metaphorically. And to interpret the physical combat as well as the juxtaposition of the shack and the skyscrapers as metaphors for what she called the vertical and horizontal conflict of the city. And that's really a structural and social theme that runs through the entire manuscript for her.
Yeah. So what was this type of book that did not yet exist? And I'm going to quote you a couple of times in my questions, but what was this type of book that did not yet exist that the two women wanted to publish? What were the key elements of McCausland's original text that made you see Changing New York in a new light?
First of all, let me assure you that I don't have a lot of text-heavy slides, but I had to bring at least one in order to really drive home how unbelievably different the original manuscript is from the text that replaced it in the published book. So in the original manuscript, I was struck by McCausland's ambitions of training the viewer, the reader-viewer, to read Abbott's photographs as both deliberate compositions and critical statements. And also what a huge difference her language makes to viewing Abbott's photographs. So this photograph, Brooklyn Bridge at Water and Dock Streets, would have come first in their manuscript. And McCausland's caption introduces the key theme of visibility and invisibility that will run through the whole book. There's her insistence here that the city is composed of invisible forces manifest in visible things. And meanwhile, the photograph itself announces that Abbott's documentary photography won't just replicate guidebook cliches like introducing the tourist to New York at the southern tip of Manhattan's financial district. Instead, she's framing that view of the financial district through visual obstacles, through change in progress, literal construction on the waterfront. She's defamiliarizing the landmark bridge. She's compressing 4 distinct moments of architectural form and technology into a single plane to show us that the present or the meaning of the present consists of their interrelationship. Meaning over and over again, McCausland's manuscript is this sort of tutorial that meaning lies in composition, and composition engenders a new kind of inspection. And you might have noted by now that the word inspection is literally painted on this brick warehouse, this Civil War era warehouse. So it's practically an imperative from the very first page of what would have been their manuscript. The second thing I noticed is a language of shock effects, which really surprised me at first, and as well as a kind of genuine delight in the cityscape that provides those. Let me show you an example, 2 examples. McCausland was constantly celebrating in this first manuscript the montages afforded by the city and how they could precipitate shocks to the consciousness. And then she would in her text, explain how the photograph can perpetuate that shock as an image. So the caption for Sumner Healy's antique shop is McCausland's wildest foray into the language of surrealism, with mixed success, admittedly. But it also alerts the viewer to many such images and such experiences in their planned manuscript, such as Chicken Market, for instance, which is one of my favorites. The third key element that I noticed in the manuscript was its unexpected attitudes towards the very concept of change, which McCausland often framed through a trope of vanishing, or the vanishing instant. Sometimes she was quite critical of the technocratic reforms being carried out in the city during the 30s. And so, for example, she tells the reader that the street vendors, like this one on the left, are vanishing due to the city's new hygienic regulations and tendency toward economic concentration. Or on the right, her original caption for Gay Street criticized the removal of its historically Black population, making the whitewashed walls into a metaphor for the whitewashing of so-called rehabilitation. And so McCausland is constantly alerting the reader to these causes of vanishing, so that Abbott's photographs aren't mistaken for simply picturesque. And then the last thing that really caught my attention was that McCausland's text was constantly mourning the varieties of experience that will be lost in what she called a future better planned city, better planned in scare quotes. Like these shadowscapes under the L tracks and the encounters that might be sheltered there, or the romance of the oldest barbershop window in New York. And you might have noted the reflection of a horse-drawn cart sort of moving out of the frame on the barbershop window. It's a very Atget-esque photo, a real homage. And both of these photographs were cut by the publisher and do not appear in the final book. So all of those things emerged to me as really clear themes and really interesting, worth following up on.
Right. So talking about especially the text and what they were trying to achieve through the text, especially McCausland, how did this research eliminate the woman's unusual theories of documentary? Were these theories inherited from Abbott's time spent in Paris with the avant-garde circles? How is it different than what was discussed at the time in terms of defining documentary practices in the United States? How were they different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that is exactly the sort of research path that this manuscript set me upon. Document and documentary were actually not yet popular terms in the United States when Abbott returned from her years in Paris in 1929. In fact, she helped introduce them to the modernist vocabulary in the United States upon her return. And her concepts were definitely an outgrowth of her activities in Europe in the 1920s, and especially the period of 1928 to 1931, when she was going back and forth a bit between New York and Europe. And most importantly, she was focused on getting Atget's photographs posthumously published and exhibited. She had acquired the collection after his death in 1927. And in that process, she really immersed herself in the avant-garde writing that was being produced about Atget and the idea of the document photograph. And that literature by Robert Desnos, Pierre McCausland, Walter Benjamin, among many others, often explored how the non-art photograph, the document photograph, as it was called in Europe at the time, could disclose a reality beneath the visible, or speak of the invisible crimes underpinning modern civilization. And these are just some examples. The one in the left is in Julia and Gary's essay, this tear sheet from La Revente, one of the many instances where Abbott was placing Atget's photographs in little magazines, and an Atget from her own collection, which is now at the Museum of Modern Art. So in Europe, the so-called new photography of the 20s was really shaped by this interest that I was just discussing in the disruptive anti-art qualities of the document. And I should say that Molly Nesbitt and Olivier Lugon have both written extensively about this, and their work was very helpful to me. It was also, the new photography was also shaped by the idea that photography was a medium uniquely suited to dialectical image making. And by that, I mean a lot of the avant-garde writing that came out around Atget's work or the new photography speculated that photography's formal properties, black and white, positive, negative, made it capable of synthesizing opposing forces into something new. A flash of perception in the form of an image, and specifically an image that has political ramifications. And we see how Abbott brought both of these threads back to the United States with her. And by the time the manuscript, this manuscript is written in 1938, McCausland was calling Abbott's image theory dynamic equilibrium. It's a phrase and an idea that is the most consistently repeated thing throughout the whole manuscript. And so repeatedly, her text explains how Abbott has brought opposing forces into dynamic equilibrium, as she calls it. And by that, she meant a meaningful composition of found juxtapositions, using the special properties of photography. Gunsmith and Police Department on the right is one of my absolute favorites. I talk about it at length in the book. If you think about its inclusion in a book that is destined for a tourist audience, it really proclaims that documentary photography is not going to affirm the predictable landmarks, but rather that its task is to reveal how invisible institutional forms of authority and violence structure the landscape. And she obviously went to considerable lengths to achieve this sort of elevated worm's eye view that makes the gun sign aimed directly into the police headquarters across the street. And ditto really for her composition on the left, where she's making the statue, the very genteel statue of an 18th century politician, confront the 20th century face of power on Wall Street.
Right. So was their definition of documentary then as a critical practice of history, and I'm quoting you, was it too complex or conceptual for a publisher like Dutton?
Yes, it was too complex for Dutton. It was too conceptual, but also not only for them. I have to say, really, most people missed it. But yes, first to explain, for Abbott, all of these formal techniques and theories that I've been discussing were marshaled to a specific mission in changing New York. And that mission is to change how photography represents history. She often said to any and everybody that documentary photography does not just record old things because they are quaint or because they are monuments. Rather, documentary is a pictorial means of analyzing the present through the past, and thus exposing the present to be a product of social and ideological forces. Her project was titled Changing New York, not Old New York. And that's because to her, documentary's job was to analyze the processes of change. And that's why Elizabeth McCausland's original text for the book was so didactic. It's exciting and fun, but it is also often didactic. She wanted to amplify the analysis that is embedded in Abbott's images, but she also really wanted to show what viewers could learn by adopting Abbott's way of seeing. And she kept insisting that change is not natural or inevitable, but rather social and political. So for example, in her caption for the photograph on the left, she explains that this modern trinity only arose through a zoning exemption for a powerful corporation, at the same time that she explains that it's only Abbott's wide angle lens that could have brought them into this relationship. And the Victorian Children's Home on the right was one of her favorite examples. She explained to the publisher in one of the early proposals for the book that when this architectural marvel was demolished to build a highway, it represented a change in social values and a change in the valuation of the city itself and what the city is good for. But in all honesty, very few of Abbott's audiences of the 30s understood this mission. The work was fairly widely published and it was exhibited at the Museum of the City of New York twice in that decade. And yet reviewers typically described her project as recording old New York before it disappeared. So they often missed the deeply critical nature of Abbott's juxtapositions or her kind of formal meditations on the conditions of visibility and invisibility.
So obviously the publisher missed a message, or I would say ignored it probably. Can you tell us what kind of alterations they made to the book and why? How did it make you rethink the historical context or situation of Changing New York's publication?
So as I said before, Dutton really thought that it had commissioned a book for tourists. And they were clearly drawing, so I really dove into studying where are the publisher's expectations coming from. I wanted to take them seriously and not just assume that they censored McCausland or that they didn't understand. I wanted to understand what their perspective was on the material that they thought they were publishing. So they clearly were drawing some expectations from earlier guidebooks and photo books for tourists, like this one from 1934, which Abbott's work is actually included in, by the way. And so Dutton kept asking for more predictable monuments and other cliches. And at the same time complaining that Abbott's photographs were cold, redundant, inexplicable. I reproduced a memo in the documents section where they have a point-by-point argument over practically every single photograph. So that's one place these expectations are coming from. In addition to demanding wholesale rewrites of McCausland's captions, they cut, as I said, 14 photographs that they considered controversial or esoteric, like Father Duffy on the left. And they tended to replace them either with photographs of glamorous modern skyscrapers like the Daily News building on the right, or with some of Abbott's more picturesque scenes like tugboats in the fog. Another important thing that the publisher did was to resequence the photographs according to a classic guidebook pattern for New York, which is to start at the southern tip of Manhattan and then move up through the picturesque neighborhoods that were still considered immigrant neighborhoods, Greenwich Village, Lower East Side, and then up to modern Midtown and sometimes up to Upper Manhattan with an emphasis on monuments and cultural institutions. So starting in 1937, a number of commercial view books of New York took that old formula and added a new ending, which was departure from Manhattan for an imagined journey to the World's Fair in Queens. still 2 years in advance for this particular book. And here you see that the look back at the Manhattan skyline at dusk that ended many a commercial photo book is actually just a prelude here to turning the page and arriving at the fair. You're introduced to a fair that doesn't even exist yet, and its vision, its promises for the future. Excuse me. And the fair, as I said, had a really important and relevant theme here. It was building the world of tomorrow. And in its main exhibits, which again were already being discussed publicly by 1937, would encourage leaving the old, dirty, dangerous city behind in favor of the rationalized regional planning of tomorrow. And I'm showing you here pages from a brochure of Democracy, which was the main exhibit inside the Paris Fair and one of the signal exhibits about the world of tomorrow. And all of the fair literature was very grandiose, but also very serious on this point, that the future of civilization and the future of democracy depended on this vision of progress. And on the cusp of World War II, right, the summer of 1939 is when the fair opens. That is a very heavily freighted message. So when I studied Dutton's resequencing, I realized that in the published book of 1939, Dutton too had adopted that itinerary of the 1937 book that I just showed. They rearranged the photographs to proceed from south to north in Manhattan and then out to Queens. And they did so in a way that took the reader on a journey of progress toward the fair. So the reader is sort of follows Abbott over this the modern Triborough Bridge, right? It just opened, takes you out to the fairgrounds. And along the way passes decrepit slums and other kinds of primitive oddities that will soon be demolished in the name of progress, or at least that's the implication in the way that Dutton reorganized the photographs. So whereas Abbott and McCausland had planned for 100 discrete moments of analysis and revelation, moments that also depended on that old, layered, diverse cityscape, the cityscape of conflict and contradiction. The published book, I think, maps a passage from the past to the future in a way that feels linear and inevitable. It's exactly the opposite of the model of history that Abbott wanted to instantiate with her photographs. And the captions in the published book, you know, they were taken out of McCausland's hands. They were entirely rewritten by the research staff. The captions in the published book reinforce this idea of progress. They're just full of statistics about who built what and at what cost. They often praise new infrastructure that was funded by the WPA. And they make it seem like Abbott's photographs are these informational reports about old New York and about progress, about a New York that's achieving a better future, rather than compositions of invisible forces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Much more poetic. So you had studied Abbott's work for a long time, but you say it's the RIC's acquisition of the archive that made this present book possible. So what new archival materials did you access to allow for the rediscovery of one of the 30s most unusual, intriguing, and rigorously theorized versions of documentary photography? And I'm quoting. And therefore allow for new narratives about Abbott, McCausland, the concept of documentary photography, etc.
The RIC's acquisition of the Abbott archive was huge for me. And it included lots of crucial items, particularly among the ephemera for my purposes. First of all, Abbott's scrapbooks from Paris, they're incredible. I knew that she collected clippings, of course, but it was eye-opening to see how obsessively she collected avant-garde writing about Atget and about the new photography. Her scrapbooks reveal that she translated a number of these essays herself, really working through their philosophies. Here, excuse me, you see the clipping of an important essay by the surrealist writer Robert Desnos, along with Abbott's handwritten and typescript collections, which just happened to also fall on the same page as one of the many essays, one of the many clippings about her purchase of Atget's collection, which did, make her internationally famous. So secondly, I don't have any pictures for this at the moment, but there was this crucial file of planning documents that surfaced in the archive that pertained to the women's plans for the Changing New York book. And it turned out they had held those back from the official files of the Federal Art Project. And so it contained these proposals, statements of purpose, sample text, detailing the women's earliest visions for the book in January 1938, right after they were approached by Dutton. And so they were enormously revealing, and I reproduced many of those transcribed in section 2. They reveal things about their theories of documentary, but also about their ambitions to cultivate the reader's critical acumen, rather than reproducing the consensus imagery of guidebooks. And last, and I really have to thank Charlene again for guiding me through the photographic material in the archive, which is overwhelming. There are some really exciting photographs from the pre-1935 period. So from before she gained federal sponsorship for her work. And many of them are small prints that just function like working notes for her. For instance, exploring light and dark, visibility and invisibility, the kind of dialectical language of photography. Others, like this picture of a Hooverville in Central Park, reveal how, and this is from 32, if you compare this to the later work, you start to see how she evolved in her practice, I think, from an emphasis on socially revealing subjects to, in the early 30s, to this strong emphasis on composing relationships, meaningful relationships, by the time her work gained federal sponsorship in 1935. So those were just a few of the many fun revelations of the archive. I'll stop sharing my screen because I think we're going to open it up to conversation.
Yes, correct. We're going to hopefully have some questions.
Hi, I'm back. I have two kind of questions. The first one, is about, one of the first image that you showed us, Sarah, the shelter on the waterfront. And we have a comment which is highlighting that it seems to be quite dangerous to be on that rooftop. And I think that the question by Phil Norton is about, about how Abbott was operating. Was she operating alone?
She was not operating alone. She did have an assistant in the field who was paid for by the Federal Art Project. She had specifically requested field assistants. She did not request research assistants. She was assigned several, and they're the ones who bastardized the captions eventually. But yeah, she did have help in the field. She used an enormous view camera. It was absolutely essential to her practice. And she, at various points in various memoirs, recounted that that she went places that were not considered appropriate or acceptable for women. I'm sure that shelter on the waterfront is one of those areas. and also that it was a very challenging project, to use a huge view camera, an 8x10 view camera in New York, given all of its environmental challenges.
Okay. Okay, the questions are coming up. One by Matt Cohn asked, did they ever speak publicly about the original manuscript?
That is a good question. Yes and no. And what I mean by that is they protested vociferously to the Federal Art Project that all of their intentions had been overwritten. They also protested that the Federal Writers Project plagiarized Abbott's work for the New York Panorama and New York City Guides that came out in 1938 and 39 respectively. And they were told basically to cease and desist for the sake of the Federal Art Project, which, it's now it's remembered as a beloved program. But like any government-sponsored art program, it was constantly under attack in the 1930s. Its funding was always in jeopardy. And the administrator of the Federal Art Project in New York told Abbott and McCausland in no uncertain terms that they could not protest in public. They could not say what happened for the good of the project at large. However, a few years later, they each published an article in a somewhat specialized photography periodical that serves to, if you know how to read between the lines, each of those articles kind of reclaims, offers a kind of manifesto on one hand about documentary photography as what Abbott called civic history, and on the other hand about book design that served to as these kind of retrospective manifestos of the philosophy they would have liked to put forth in changing New York. But they were not widely read outside of photography circles.
Okay. Okay, the next question is, can you say something about how McCausland and Abbott came to work together?
Yeah. I should say that the expert on all personal matters is Julia Van Haften. Her biography, for those of you who haven't seen it, came out 2 years ago and is a gold mine. And I could never have done this book without all of the research support that she shared with me. And that includes things like her relationship with McCausland, all the ins and outs. They met because McCausland was a fairly well-known art critic who wrote for the Springfield Republican. And she reviewed Abbott's 1934 show at the Museum of the City of New York. And announced to the world in her review that this was truly a new photography, a new kind of photography with profound implications. And after that, and they were introduced to each other somewhere in that process. And by 1935, the next year, McCausland had moved to New York to be with Abbott. And after that, they launched a 30-year partnership that was both romantic and creative. They really collaborated very closely for the rest of the 30s and into the 40s. And I should also say that McCausland sort of ghost wrote many things that appeared in Abbott's name after 1935.
Okay, I have plenty of questions coming up, so it's a bit overwhelming. One question, which is very straightforward, but makes no sense. Since the published text barely resembles what McCausland wrote, did she object to being named as an author when the book was published?
Again, yes and no. It was very painful to her that the text was really not hers by the time it appeared. On the other hand, she had so much difficulty getting equal credit for the book, which she had been contracted for and which she had been promised, that I don't think she was willing to take her name off of it. So it was just a painful dilemma, essentially.
Okay, we have a question about the sequencing of the images, because still, I mean, after your explanation, it seems to be quite standard, you know, the alphabetical order. What were actually the standards at the time for sequencing images in books, you know, and how does it compare with what was done in Changing New York?
So are you asking what was the standard at the time?
Yes.
Yeah, the standard really, New York more than any other city had acquired a very standard guidebook pattern, as I said, from southern Manhattan to, you know, through the immigrant neighborhoods to Midtown, sometimes to northern Manhattan or out to the boroughs. And so that's the pattern that Dutton followed when they resequenced Abbott's photographs. However, the original manuscript had a very interesting, and I only figured it out by writing out all of the titles in a list, and suddenly it jumped out at me that they were arranged, Abbott and McCausland had arranged them alphabetically by title. You might think that that's logical. However, Abbott's titles could range from the completely poetic to the completely prosaic, with no rhyme or reason why one or the other. And so she had them filed by title, and in a sense, it could have been just convenience, but it also really evoked for me the surrealist interest in lexicons, you know, and encyclopedias, dictionaries, this alphabetical ordering. And it seems that they had picked the photographs in two passes, right? So the titles were alphabetical from 1 to 43, and then they started over at 44 to 100, as if they had gone through Abbott's files twice in alphabetical order. And I don't want to make too much of that because I really don't know what they intended from that. But I will say that the effect would have been much more surrealist, and it afforded these wonderful, unexpected moments of juxtaposition that could often be quite illuminating because they did not have a geographical relationship to each other. They had a more conceptual relationship to each other. And so you can see in the resequencing, you know, of the reconstruction that I did in the book, lots of wonderful kinds of pairings emerge that that never would have happened, that did not happen in the 1939 book because of its sort of geographical itinerary. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. We still have a bit of time. So how was the published book received at the time?
It was received well, but not overwhelmingly enthusiastically. It was widely reviewed. It was widely acclaimed, but I do think that the boring book design, the boring captions, really undercut what it could have been. And Abbott was really well known and well respected in her time, right? So she got just as many reviews as somebody like Weston would have. She got as many reviews as Walker Evans got for American Photographs the year before. It was definitely an acclaimed book, but I would say that it fell off the radar more quickly than it would have otherwise because of the compromises that had been made. I think a lot about that in terms of, you know, Walker Evans, you know, had Lincoln Kirstein to write the essay that would put him on the map in 1938 in his book, American Photographs, you know, and that would keep that book in the canon for decades to come. And I think in a sense, McCausland's original text could have done that for Abbott, given that they were very much on equal footing in their fame and their respect. If anything, Abbott was more respected because she circulated more. I think that McCausland's text could have done that for Abbott, given that Changing New York was in many ways her most important work. But ultimately that didn't happen because of the many sort of compromises that the published book contains. And the only reviewer, I will say, the only reviewer who acknowledged that the book had not been entirely under Abbott and McCausland's control was Beaumont Newhall, who was about to become the photography curator at the Museum of Modern Art and who was a good friend of both of them. But even he was very diplomatic about it in print, so he obviously had heard from Abbott and McCausland that they were not allowed to complain.
Okay, I have another question. Could you speak about your use of referring as Abbott and McCausland as the woman?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Can you speak about your use of referring as Abbott and McCausland as the woman? I understand this as a stance against such a male-dominated photo/publishing culture. How do you think about Berenice Abbott and McCausland's theory on history in the present with how we understand their gender now?
I don't know that I can answer that. I honestly don't know.
Good.
I mean, I can speak to the question of how gender may or may not have played a role in their reception. I'm not really sure how to connect it to their theories of history.
Okay, next question. People rarely appear in Abbott's photo. What does it reveal or suggest for you?
That's an excellent point. In fact, Dutton complained a lot that there were not enough people in Abbott's photos. They really had clearly not paid much attention before they wrote this contract to publish her work. Part of it is that she was using an 8x10 view camera. So she is really studying her compositions and making long studied exposures. She is interested in architecture and the built environment primarily as a kind of evidence of invisible forces, more so than she is interested in people. She also admittedly did ask the Federal Art Project for a 35mm camera, and they were not forthcoming. So it's hard to say what she would have done if she had received it. People do actually appear in the photographs, but they are not protagonists of historical change in the same way that they were, for instance, in Lang's photographs. I think really that architecture and the built environment are the protagonists of her work, and people are usually incidental, except in those rare cases like Shelter on the Waterfront, where she happened to capture people literally in the middle of a physical fight. And McCausland extrapolated from that about the sort of other kinds of structural violence represented by that conflict.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. What was the relationship between Abbott's work and FSA photography? Same time.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Maybe one question.
So the FSA, well, the RA, which became the FSA, was created in the same year as the Federal Art Project. So in terms of federal funding, both came into place at the same time. But I should say that Abbott really understood her receipt of federal funding under the WPA just to simply be supporting the works that she was already doing, right? She was never commissioned to do something for the government in the same way that the FSA photographers were supposed to be providing reportage for the Department of Agriculture. We know that they did many other things with that opportunity, but nonetheless, there is a structural difference there. Because the FSA was only, or the RA and then FSA was only formed in 35 and really did not achieve any kind of popular attention for its new forms of documentary photography until 1938. I would say really did not have any kind of popular breakthrough. Abbott's work, Abbott's understanding of documentary was never shaped by the FSA. If anything, it was the other way around. Roy Stryker consulted her. He never tried to hire her, but he did solicit her ideas. He solicited writing from both Abbott and McCausland when he was trying to figure out his own theories of documentary and how to shape the work of his photography unit. And she shared with him things like a grant application, other kinds of statements of documentary. But that's all to say that the FSA, which we now think of right now as dominating the kind of definition and practice of documentary, did not have any kind of authoritative, did not establish any kind of authoritative framework for what people thought documentary should mean until at least 1938. But by 1938, their work was becoming well known. There was a significant show in New York in 1938 that was one of the first to really put the work into the popular consciousness beyond its kind of journalistic functions. And I do think that Abbott's publishers were contending with many competing notions of documentary by 1938 when the manuscript was under revision. And so one of them came from the FSA. Like I said, not necessarily a controlling or authoritative definition, but it was out there. So was Margaret Bork-White's You Have Seen Their Faces. So was the Photo League. So by 1938, there's this really active discussion with many versions of documentary all circulating and contending with each other. And I think that impinged on the editorial process of the book and various stakeholders' expectations.
Okay, I think it's more or less time to conclude, but I want to conclude with a comment from someone you both know very well because she contributed to the Abbott book that Gaëlle edited. It's a comment from Terry Weisman, who said, "This is not a question, but a giant congratulations, Sarah." And I just want to join Terry to congratulate you, Sarah, for this amazing book. And I want to thank you, Gaëlle, for conducting this discussion today. Maybe one last note about the book. If you are interested in buying the book, the link to our website should be found in the chat box. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you all.